On affirmative, we have AMU 1, and on negative, we have Melbourne 2. Under the motion that it is wrong for parents to accept confidential settlement from the Catholic Church. For timing, there'll be a bell at the 6th minute. I hope that's audible. And twice in the 8th minute, and so on for applause. To open the debate, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the app, Richard. Here.
Mr. Speaker, across the world, the Catholic Church had a position of trust with people, and it violated that trust horrendously. We think that that is absolutely appalling. What we saw was the Catholic Church provided boarding schools and pastoral care, particularly to poorer people within our society, and it abused those people, particularly children. We see that it is estimated that 1 in 20 fathers globally across the Catholic Church violated and abused children, and that is a shame. We think that what we've seen nowadays is that now that people are starting to move away from these confidentiality agreements that they signed with the church, there have been cases coming before the courts, and in response we've seen things like royal commissions that are finally going to expose that level of abuse that occurred. We think that that has been too long coming and meant that people have had to live with the scars of their assaults and abuses for far too long, Mr. Speaker. I've got 4 arguments in substantive. So firstly, I'm going to tell you about what these agreements actually are. Secondly, I'm going to say how we'll get better reporting, how we would have got better reporting if these agreements had not been signed. Thirdly, I'll tell you why it was principally preferable, even if we didn't get better reporting, that these agreements had not been signed. And thirdly, why we think reporting is beneficial to children and third parties in that state. Okay, so firstly, what were these agreements? So what we saw is that often when people have children who are abused, they would then go forward and either approach the police about that abuse or approach the church itself about that abuse. If they approached the police about that abuse, the police would contact those churches, and those churches would get in contact with those parents. We think as a result of the pastoral position that those priests had, they were able to advise those parents that the Catholic Church and that God wants reconciliation and forgiveness, not justice. And they could tell those people that if you would sign these agreements, that was a good way to reconcile with the church, rather than dragging out a legal battle that they were unlikely to prove. We thought as a result that there was intense pressure on these parents to sign these agreements. We think that these agreements in some states were actually legally binding on parents and restricted their abilities to actually report these assaults. But in the instances that they weren't legally binding, we recognised that they were definitely morally and religiously binding on those people, because they viewed it as a pact between them and their church as a representative of their God. So we think that that really restricted people's abilities to ever come forward with that, particularly the parents and children into future generations and years. So we think that these agreements did restrict that. How do we think if these confidentiality agreements hadn't been signed, we would have seen better reporting in response? Because we thought that people would have sought justice that was otherwise denied to them if they had not been able or had chosen not to sign these agreements. Why is that? Because we think that these parents at the first level showed an intent to seek justice, which they then didn't follow through with completely. Why is this? We see 2 reasons. Firstly, we think that there were groups of people who approached the police themselves. So those people obviously had an intention to report that crime and to get some action happening. But then they were pressured by the fathers within that church that what they were doing was going to bring disrepute to their church and would bring shame to their family, and that God wanted them to sign these agreements. So we think that that led to them signing this instead of seeking justice. Secondly, those people who didn't go to the police had even less agency in this, because if you approach that church yourself, you were directly counseled that what you should do is sign this agreement because it's something that shouldn't be talked about and it's something that we should suppress in the interests of reconciliation. We think that if these parents had not been able to get this form of justice, or had chosen not to get this form of justice, what we would have got is those parents actually following through with the reporting of these crimes, and that would have seen better outcomes for these children in the reasons I'm going to tell you about in my fourth argument. Secondly, though, we think that children would have been more likely to report these crimes had these agreements not been signed, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we think that when these agreements were signed, children were told by their religious fathers and their biological parents that justice had been done and that this issue had been dealt with and it was something we could move on with. Secondly, we thought that those children would have been much more likely to come forward and report those crimes in the first instance if they had not been counselled in such a way by people in that position of trust. But we think that as a result of people being told through their whole childhood that that crime was something that had been dealt with and had been reconciled, that led to these children being less likely to report those crimes into the future, because it was something that they had rammed down their throats all through their growing up, that this was something that was dealt with and that they should move on from that and they should grow up and get past that crime. So we think that those children would have been much more likely to report into the future had these agreements not been signed. Thirdly, though, we think that the Catholic Church would have been less likely to suppress these crimes, because it meant that there wasn't a critical mass or even very many people at all coming forward and reporting these crimes. So the Catholic Church would completely deny the extent of this abuse, which we know to be so pervasive and so wrong. So we think that this meant the Catholic Church didn't have to tackle these problems and could get away with shifting priests between parishes and things like that, which we don't think were real solutions. Thirdly, why do we think not signing this was principally preferable if nothing had happened? Because we think that firstly this would challenge a culture of secrecy within the church, because the church would be forced to accept that people are challenging this outcome and challenging it in the courts, or challenging it in person rather than willing to sign away their rights. But secondly, though, we think it was principally preferable because it wouldn't absolve priests and the church of any wrongdoing, because we think it was really important that people who did abuse these children had to face up to their crimes or face up to their wrongs. They couldn't think that this document had been signed and that they were absolved of their sins and everything was going to be okay. So we think that even if we didn't get that critical mass of people coming forward, we had principally better outcomes if people had gone on to report to not sign these agreements. Thirdly, why do we think that reporting to the police was beneficial to children and third parties? Firstly, for children. We think that it allowed priests to stay in those parishes in a lot of circumstances, or it moved priests between parishes. But we think that that decision of parents was not appropriate because it was based on community pressure not to report and financial pressure, particularly for those poorer Catholic families. We think that there was also religious pressure on these parents to let those crimes go ahead, to not be reported. We think, moreover, that because of the time, people weren't aware of the lasting mental effect that this would have on their children. So they didn't know that this abuse would go on to harm their children into the future. We thought that reporting was always a better outcome because it would assist the healing process of that child, and because people would be more able to tackle their psychological problems. But moreover, it meant that the state was more likely to give services because the abuse was recognised and happening to many people, and that meant the state would be compelled to do something about that rather than allowing this abuse to continue. Mr. Speaker, we think that the abuse that happened within the Catholic Church was absolutely appalling, and that parents owed it to their children to allow them to seek justice. We're proud to propose.
open the case from the opposition, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of negative, Beth.
In the opposition's case, they never wanted to consider what the alternative would be for parents who didn't accept these settlements. They never considered the fact that the three things that were likely to occur were that you'd either get people simply not coming forward at all, or you get cases that wouldn't be resolved, or you end up with long and protracted court cases that harm the people who had come forward, that harm those victims, that led to bad outcomes for society as a whole, because you didn't get a church claiming full liability, and you didn't get good reporting on that in that matter. We think particularly for the victims of these crimes, it's so horrendous, which has led them to have a total loss of their own control and agency. We don't think we should force them to go through some sort of court case. And we think that in cases where you haven't been allowed to do that, they are unlikely to simply come forward at all. We think that leads to bad outcomes and bad results in this debate. Two questions in rebuttal. First of all, why will we still get all sort of good, will we get all sorts of good social utility outcomes like royal commissions they want to talk about when people have accepted those settlements? And secondly, we'll talk about in terms of justice and thirdly about whether it's okay for parents to accept it. First one, in terms of sort of outcomes they wanted to talk about, and they said that there were lots of things like royal commissions which came because of the fact that you had those long court cases. We pointed to the fact, first of all, those things occurred in the context where more and more people have been taking settlements and have actually been happening. Moreover, we think those things that occur, despite that, the people who are coming forward don't have any greater sense of social duty above and beyond the fact they have come forward and said that this crime occurred. We don't think that we should force them to go through anything more, even if that social utility were arise. We think they don't have to have a greater duty to the public, they duty to themselves and to their children. But secondly, in terms of what we could get in terms of justice, we heard a couple of things about why we were more likely to get justice when people didn't accept settlements. We disagree in the first place that going through a court case necessarily equals more justice by the mere fact of being there. Number one, we would defer to victims determining their own sense of justice and determining their own outcome. We think that is the best kind of justice when people can say what they want out of the situation and what they think is the best thing to occur. Second of all, we think that the parents who want to go to court are likely to have incentives in line with their children because they also went through the pain of having their child sexually abused. We think there are bad repercussions for the parents as well, and they deserve the right to have their rights upheld. But thirdly, they ignore the fact that in a large number of these cases, the actual individual who perpetrated this crime is often dead or missing or can't actually be personally held to account. That meant that settlements were often the best case of justice because they meant that families could be recompensated financially because there was no individual to necessarily have had that individual punishment. We thought that was an important stakeholder in this debate. Secondly, in terms of what happened when they told us about why people leave the through, we think when people report to the police that shows an intention to report a crime. We think, yes, absolutely that does, and the fact that they reported to the police means they did. We don't think that necessarily commits them to having to follow any particular plan, nor should it commit them to having to follow any particular plan. We think more of it to the people who didn't go to the police and had nothing at all. We think, first of all, under their model, they're not going, in their world, they wouldn't have come forward in the first place at all. If they knew there was going to be a long court case, they weren't even willing to go through that in the first place, they were unlikely to not willing to go through that. More of them would defer again their right to do so. Thirdly, in terms of parents and what their rights are, we recognise the ability of a child to actually have a parent act on behalf of them. I think particularly in this situation it's appropriate that parents act on behalf of these kids. First, because these children are likely to be more vulnerable. We think more of it, parents are actually more likely to understand the likely outcomes. They're better able to equip to deal with what is going to be the best situation to achieve that justice. Moreover, we think there are a number of reasons that parents would choose a settlement. And it was wrong for them to simply assert it was because there was community and financial pressure on those parents. We think there are a number of instances where people decided they don't want to go through a pain of a court case, they don't want to force their kid through months and potentially years of what could go on, and we think it's a legitimate decision for them to have made. We think most parents would be acting in the best interest of their family. We think there's a natural incentive that exists and doesn't simply have to be administered by pressure. Moreover, we think kids will likely be susceptible to that same pressure anyway. We think, lastly, in terms of secrecy, we've heard church will be more likely to hide things when they actually are able to go through this. We think when people are able to access settlements, that is a good thing because it's in line with the church's incentive to to actually accept liability. We think you get a better acceptance of liability when you allow settlement, because you are more likely to get an acceptance of liability because it is quicker and is also easier. We think that is the main outcome we want to see in this debate, is having the church accept liability for its actions. 2 points to stand. First of all, why confidential settlements are a necessary option to have available to those parents, why it is a good thing that they chose it. But second of all, why we think it's the most successful option to actually expose the church's liability, why it's important. First of all, why it's a necessary option. We think it is absolutely justified for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I told you before in rebuttal, we don't think the families victims of any greater duty to society above and beyond that to themselves. We think that maximum duty was discharged the fact that they actually came forward about that crime and made it known. We think that's enough. We think the matter of financial reparation should be a private matter because it means they're actually going to determine what sort of recompense they can get. There are obvious reasons to keep this confidential. First of all, because we don't think we want to direct media attention towards the actual sum of money. We think it's a better fact to simply say that there was a settlement and there was the church being held liable in the first place. We think that redirects media attention to the fact that there was a crime occurred. A crime did occur, and the church did actually accept responsibility for that, rather than the sum of money and comparing the sum of money between different particular crimes. We think, moreover, that we actually end up with a better outcome in terms of for those people being able to accept that. We think the church has a natural incentive to want reform in these particular situations. We think that has helped when the church is more likely to accept liability in these cases. We think also settlements lead to better justice, and this occurs for a number of reasons. We think it's important to consider, particularly the sort of people who are coming forward in these situations. So there's parents and kids who've been subject to one of the most personally damaging crimes that can never occur. We heard that as well on our affirmative team. What we need to do is a couple of things. First of all, we think we recognise in other situations that sexual crimes are different from other crimes by allowing people anonymity. We think that's the same thing that should be upheld here, by people allowing to get out of court cases in a quicker situation. We think, second of all, we think we also recognise there is a need to encourage people to come forward. This is the case people are less likely to come forward than for other crimes. We think we incentivise that by allowing court cases that end quicker, and we also have a clearer result. We think you get both of those things with confidential settlements because there's something that is more likely to occur and more outcomes. Thirdly, we recognise these people are simply just more vulnerable than people in other situations. We think that from this situation, we think that confidential settlements aren't as desirable for these people. They're also necessary, providing them with a safe option, and recognise that there is an option out of the court. Second of all, why we think it's the most successful option to expose the church's liability. We think that you get a better acceptance of liability from the church than when you get a payout and when you force it through a court case for a number of reasons. Firstly, we think you are simply more likely to get a sheer number of people coming forward in the first place because they know there is likely to be a clear outcome for them, and if they don't have the financial resources to pursue a long court case, they are able to do this option, they are still likely to come forward in the first place. But second of all, because you allow the confidentiality, so people know they can keep their privacy, they know they actually don't have to disclose the amount of money they got, but they won't have to be forced to pressure because of that. Second of all, because you encourages journalists to take more views, to take more restraint and sensitivity in these matters, because they're more likely to focus on the sheer fact of the church being held liable, because they can't focus on the amount of money that was held to account, and more they don't have a long court case to report on. We think when you have independent reports of a court case that's been going on for years and years, it doesn't generate the same sort of public message as it does when you actually have a sheer outcome in terms of simply having someone be held liable and showing that the church actually held accountability. Second one turns into an existential challenge, because we think it's recognized, the church has to suddenly recognize that it actually is a change the way it works. We think we've seen this, because we've seen more, when you get more cases occurring, people are more likely to actually have outcomes with that money. We've seen that by the church approaching financial insolvency in some states in America. That means that full reform is forced through because they have no other option than to recognize the consequences of what has been happening for years. We think we're more likely to get reform under those circumstances. We're also more likely to get people to come forward and have better justice to people who are allowed to choose that justice for themselves without recommending private fashion.
I thank the first speaker of negative for her speech, and now I'd like to welcome the second speaker of affirmative, Laura.
Ladies and gentlemen, Beck wanted you to believe that the worst thing for fixing abuse in the Catholic Church is to have long and protracted court cases. We're calling rubbish on that, ladies and gentlemen. We think the best thing that comes out of a court case is when you have a conviction of a priest who is held up as an example, when you have evidence of someone who is offended against a child, that's how you get change. We think when you have confidential settlements, the very definition of that is that those priests don't get exposed. Those churches get no public backlash. There is no public information about the offences that occurred. That means you get no change. What happens as a result of that is offending priests don't get criticised. Those churches don't carry out investigations. They either stay in the parish and the family stops going there, or they get moved to a parish where there's a space where they can continue offending against children. Your imperative is wrong. You've given us no mechanism of how you're going to fix that. We think that's why our case is standing. 3 questions in rebuttal. Firstly, is confidential settlements good for healing and reporting of children who have been affected? Secondly, are parents good decision makers for their children? And thirdly, what will this do for the exposure of the church's liability? So what about first this question of whether or not it's good for healing and reporting? And what we heard from the opposition today is like people are not going to come forward when they think that they have to go through these protracted court cases. Okay, number 1, we think like people do not only report now because they think that there's a settlement like at the end of the tunnel. People report now because they are concerned about the welfare of their children. We think that what happens is when you have confidential settlements in place, that means that when a parent goes to a bishop to report something that's happened to their child, that church can then like collude against that family, place pressure on them not to go towards the courts, pressure them to keep it hush-hush, and we think that there is so much like institutional and religious pressure on that family to accept those settlements. We don't think people go there like hoping for a settlement because they think it's a great thing. Like we think what it actually is a harmful consequence that stops justice from being delivered to those children. We think that parents already have an intention to come forward. We think we've seen that intention with the fact that parents coming forward now, even if they're going into confidential settlements. We think that what will happen when you sort of condemn these settlements is I think you create cultural change in the Catholic Church. You create a sense that like it is not okay for this to be covered up. You force the church to start engaging with victims, which is something that historically has not been done well. We think like that actually creates a culture where parents are more likely to come forward, where parents are more likely to feel like their children will get justice, where those offenders can be exposed and punished. So we think that's a good thing that we stand for on this side of the house. Richard gave you a lot of analysis about like why these parents will still have incentives to report, and we don't think we've heard sufficient responses from that. But then about this idea of like, can children be protected through the court system? Well, we think it is not acceptable to hear from the opposition that like we will allow this abuse to be endemic in the Catholic Church because we think that court procedures are too arduous. Okay, why is that not true? Firstly, we think that like children's identities can be suppressed when they're going through these court cases. We think that protects them. We also think there's already special measures that make it really easy for children to go into courtrooms. I think it's things like you're not allowed to use leading questions for children, or you're not allowed to have cross-examination from the defence. I think these special measures make it easier for children in those situations. But even if we accept that these court processes can be fundamentally damaging or harmful to children, which we think in some cases they can be, we think our preference is always that abuse should be disclosed. We think that it should always go through those channels of justice. Why? Because we think it's more important in the long run. We think it is more important that there are people coming forward and having like the short-term harm of going through a court case rather than going through the long-term harm of like having psychological harm and guilt because your attacker never gets brought to justice. I'm going to talk about that more in my substantive material. Then we heard about Beck, like court is harmful for parents. We do not think parents are the stakeholder in this debate. We think the most important stakeholder is children. We think children benefit most from getting a sense of justice and seeing that their attacker has been condemned. And then we have this idea that like priests are often dead or missing. Like we call bullshit. We think that happens in a minority of cases. What we see in the majority of cases is those priests stay in the same parish where they offended against children or they're moved to a neighbouring one. So we think that's fine. But we also think that like in the case that they are dead or missing, we think it is still psychologically valuable for children to be able to know and to have that person publicly condemned rather than accepting a settlement. On this idea of whether or not parents are good decision makers, Richard gave you a lot of analysis about why parents are influenced by things like the notion of them being shunned from their community if they come forward and make a public statement, or that parents have a financial motive to accept that money, which may like override what is actually in the best interest of the child. So we don't think that they're actually the best decision makers in those confidential settlements. And in terms of exposure to churches' liability, I've kind of dealt with that. We think that what already happens is the best way you expose that liability is ensuring that they are publicly condemned, that they go through the normal channels of the justice system, that the Catholic Church is forced to defend itself, forced to engage with those allegations, and that those priests cannot continue just living and working in nearby parishes. Onto my substantive material, what I'm going to talk about is why confidential settlements fundamentally impede the healing process of children. And what we heard from Beck, which we agree with on this side of the house, is that a lot of the psychological harm associated with abuse involves things like a loss of control and a sense of blame and a sense of guilt among those children who have been affected. Why? Like, how does this play out? We think that what we often see is that children who have been offended against by priests, or by anyone for that matter, we are often made to believe that they were complicit in that act. We think that they are often told things like they wanted it, or they didn't do enough to stop it, and children are made to feel like it's partially their fault. But we also think that children have so little power against the priests who are offending against them, priests who are held up in their community, priests who are leaders of the church. And we think that children find it really difficult to see those priests as someone who is harming them or someone who is doing something wrong. So we think a lot of what happens when a child is offended against by a priest, we think that they grow up with a sense that they've done something wrong, that somehow that they were complicit in that. We think that that is really psychologically harmful. We think the worst thing about the opposition's case is that when you have confidential settlements in place, you absolutely worsen that psychological damage. Why? Firstly, settlements don't have an outcome of right or wrong. When you have a confidential settlement, like you walk into a room, you walk out, and your parents tell you that it's all been sorted, we can go home now. Meaning like there is no condemnation for the priest who committed the act against you, there is no sense of justice, and there is nothing that restores to that child that they are an innocent victim who did nothing wrong. We think that they then take on that burden of guilt, they take on that burden of blame, because the very act of the settlement worsens and in some ways condones the act that occurred to them. We think that is absolutely harmful. But secondly, we think that attackers don't get punished or judged or condemned for their actions on a public scale when there is a confidential settlement in place. We think there is no repercussions for them. I think what that means is that children are forced to live with the pain of their abuse forever while they watch the person who attacked them go on with no consequences. We think that is psychologically scarring. We think that that is fundamentally harmful for those children. And we think it stops them from healing because they see that the person who fundamentally damaged them is not being brought to justice, that no one is trying to punish that person, that no one is trying to restore the imbalance that has occurred. But then we also think that what it leads to is children developing a sense of shame. When you go through a confidential settlement, that means it's something that shouldn't be talked about. It's something that should be kept hush-hush. And we think the connotations of that is it is something that is embarrassing, it is something that is harmful for the child, and we think that is fundamentally difficult for that child to then be able to heal from that abuse. We know that something that is really important for healing from abuse is being able to talk about it, is being able to recognise that a person wronged you and that you were an innocent victim in that situation. So we think that yes, testifying is hard. Yes, court cases can be lengthy. But we think that those are things we are absolutely willing to accept for the broader benefits of being able to reduce this abuse and to protect the interest of victims. I am very proud to propose.
Thank the second affirmative for her speech. And now I'd like to welcome the second speaker of the opposition, Tara.
Mr. Speaker, the affirmative team didn't just need to prove that a protracted court case was better than the alternative that was a settlement, which we didn't even accept in the first place, but also that a substantial majority of people would have even chosen to fight that case in the first place, would have reported a crime that they didn't think that they would end up winning a case about in court, that they would fight that case, that they would continue to fight that case for the years that it would take to settle, that their family would support them for the duration of that case, that that case would never be biased in terms of its reflection against them, that they would never have to answer questions that they made them feel culpable for the crimes that occurred. The reason why people accepted settlements in this debate, Mr. Speaker, was that because they were so scared of what would have happened otherwise. Because they didn't want to pursue that court case because they recognised the harms that existed. And that was why that was the better outcome for them. Two issues in rebuttal. First, on justice for victims, and second, on the effects on the church. Firstly, in terms of justice for victims, it was widely and repeatedly asserted on the other side of the House that people would report crimes more if they didn't have access to settlement as an option. Mr. Speaker, never was it explained throughout the two speakers of assertion we've heard so far why the cultural and social pressure that the church had over people would suddenly disappear just because they were no longer offering settlements or because people were no longer taking settlements. We actually think it's important to view the relationship between the church and the victims in this debate as it actually existed. In cases where you have a protracted court battle, that's an adversarial relationship. They can't just dismiss reconciliation as an important aspect of the justice that people who accepted settlements received, Mr. Speaker, especially when that reconciliation was the thing that made those victims feel better. Even when that reconciliation was the thing that, as I'll talk about in my substantive, improved the outcomes in terms of how the church operated. But also, just because missing or deceased priests were a minority in this debate doesn't mean they can ignore them as a stakeholder. What did they argue? First, it's better to get justice in court. Mr. Speaker, they never proved that had people not settled, they would have gone and proceeded with that case and would have then succeeded in advocating that case in the first place. Considering that this debate is empirical and we can look at the outcomes that people actually encountered, we know that people had to encounter incredibly long court cases, that they weren't always successful. And these were the reasons that pushed people in the first place to pursue settlements, because these people didn't exist in a vacuum outside of the interactions of all of the other people who made successful claims, and those claims were helpful in their justice. Secondly, we think the benefit of those settlements, as opposed to individual court cases, is that they hold the entire church accountable, as opposed to specific individuals or specific arms of that church. And that's an important symbolic message you get out of that settlement that you don't when people don't pursue them. And thirdly, we think it's a necessarily adversarial environment. They haven't sufficiently responded to the way in which victims are undermined in that context. They ignored, for example, the potential for the church to actually launch a case in its defence, Mr. Speaker. The case isn't just a discussion of all the different ways the church is guilty, but it's the church trying to prove that it wasn't liable for the offence that occurred. If they're accepting that that is the context in which this discussion occurs, they need to also figure in the way victims respond to that. Telling that victim repeatedly that they're responsible for that crime or that somebody else isn't responsible for that crime is an incredibly harmful process. We avoid that with the settlement process, where it's easier for the church to accept culpability because they don't need to go through that protected court case. Secondly, we heard that without settlements, people would have reported to the police more. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, they didn't just have to report to the police more. They then had to decide to press the case and to fight the case, and they needed the resources to fight that case. None of the steps of that chain of logic were proved on the other side of the house. But secondly, if there was pressure to accept those claims in the first place in regards to those churches, they never explained why those churches' incentives would suddenly change because the settlement existed. Secondly, we think the effect of a failed or protracted case is incredibly important in this debate, because when one case fails, not only does it deprive other people of the opportunity to fight their cases because they're less confident of winning, but it also teaches them that if you want to fight a case and hold this individual accountable, you're going to be unsuccessful. And we think that's a terrible normative message that was faced by those people who did adopt the stance of the other side. Finally, we heard that there are precautions to help children in court. That doesn't help the fact that the crime is discussed repeatedly, that they're told that the priest who abused them isn't responsible by that side of the case. We think those things are inevitable and inherent harms that they have to deal with when they choose this kind of approach. Second issue in rebuttal, on the effects on the church. We heard from their side that that not accepting settlements forced the church to engage with would have forced the church to engage with victims. First, we don't think this is true when you make the church's incentives far more adversarial, because now the outcome of proving its liability in court affects its outcome in the public, which is very different to our model, because our model aligns the incentives of the church to offer that settlement so that they can then, after that, resolve the issue of culpability, and that's a more important one to discuss in the public light. Secondly, they trashed reconciliation without justification. We don't accept that just because the church wanted reconciliation, it was necessarily a bad thing. We think it's largely helped a lot of victims, and that's a benefit you get under our side of the house. Thirdly, we think that an inevitable outcome of this kind of approach is that you see families outcast from the church and their communities. We think that it's ridiculous to assume that when you pursue a case against your own church, that church community wouldn't then ostracize or cast you out. That doesn't even need to be an explicit casting out, Mr. Speaker, but just the implicit rejection of you as a member of that community. That when religion was so important to these people that they grew up around priests, that then telling them that they no longer belong in that community is a far greater punishment than we were ever going to inflict on them. Finally, we heard that there'd be no condemnation for priests with a settlement. This was ridiculous. We saw it as a statement of liability, and that's how the public saw it. And that relates to my substantive. How the church's response has improved because of the existence of confidential settlements. We think with public settlements or no settlements or protracted trials, which are the necessary outcomes of their side of the case, there were two outcomes that existed. First, you saw a more antagonistic and defensive posturing by the church. That was because they had to disprove liability rather than resolve the issue of the grief that existed for that family, rather than moving on and trying to solve the issue of future abuses occurring. Secondly, they're less focused on the important issue in debate. That is how to respond to and solve the problem of abuse. This was a problem they prioritised in their rhetoric, Mr. Speaker, but they could never actually prove substantively that their preferred outcome would lead to these kinds of outcomes. Whereas we say that more shifting of priests between parishes and shifting the blame generally comes from a court case where you have to prove liability. You don't have to do that in a settlement, except that you already admit liability as part of that, and that's an important step to moving on. We think this debate is more importantly comparative, Mr. Speaker. So what we have to prove here is that these people will shift, that the church will shift priests around less, or that they did shift them around less, if because of the fact that settlements were an available option. We think the outcomes of settlements being available meant that the church was far less antagonistic and defensive in the way that it helped these abuse victims. Which means first, it's more likely to offer the support services of the church in solving their issues, but secondly, it's more able to act as a reconciliatory and also counselling body. We think that when you've just launched a court case against your church, it's less likely to be wanting to do these things because it sees you as fighting its image and its existence in a very public way. Mr. Speaker, not only because we ensure that some justice at all occurs in this debate, because their form of justice was so bad and so out of line with the incentives of victims, and also because we help the church to deal with this problem in the future, we're proud to oppose.
The second speaker of opposition for their speech, and I'd like to welcome the third speaker of affirmative, Tom.
Mr. Speaker, we thought it was bizarre for Melbourne to go through this entire debate defending the idea that there was some kind of sense of justice that came about from confidential settlements. We thought that they backpedaled after Beck's speech from trying to prove that was the case, and instead resorted simply to attacking what happened in our world. But the truth was that the only way that these children could ever get meaningful justice was in two circumstances. One, when the perpetrator of that crime actually went behind bars, something that never ever happened in your world. And secondly, when there was meaningful change in the way people talked about pedophilia within the Catholic Church, which was also something that you guys could never deliver because you were defending confidential agreements, something which throughout your entire case you guys just stated over. Before I address the two questions in this debate, will reporting increase? What is in the best interest of children? Quickly, what do we have to prove on our side of the debate? Because Tyrone tried to engage in some burden pushing. What we were going to prove to you today is that there was going to be some change in the number of people who came forward, and that would be the kind of coming forward where there would actually be meaningful justice, where it would create discussion and where we would put that perpetrator behind bars. That was important for two reasons. Firstly, because it created a cultural change that allowed other people to come forward and forced a response from both the state and from the church that made other people less likely to be subject to those crimes. But secondly, because even within the context of a single community or a single child, the benefit of coming forward in a public way was astronomically more than what you guys offered. Because as I will explain in more detail, it's the only way that any kind of healing process and any kind of benefit to those children could actually occur. Okay, first question in this debate. Why will reporting increase under our model? We gave you extensive analysis at Richard's speech about why every actor in this debate is more likely to report in a way that is public under our model. We'll explain to you why it is only that kind of reporting that helps the interests of children in my second issue. Richard told you that parents had shown a desire for a sense of justice, that in many circumstances they had actually already gone to the authorities in the first instance before the church swayed them not to take that case any further. We also told you that the church has much this ability to place moral and financial pressure on those families when they don't have the option of offering those people settlements. For those reasons, people were actually more likely to go through court proceedings, something that you guys never engaged with. We secondly told you that children were likely to change their behaviour, because there was no kind of ability for authority figures to claim that their crime had been sorted out and that justice had been done when the children themselves knew that that wasn't the case. It was easier for them to come forward in that context. But thirdly, and most importantly, we told you that we only needed to prove that a few cases would come out, because that produced the kind of cultural change that made both justice for those victims more likely and for more victims to actually come forward and disclose what had happened to them. Because we told you that victims would have less of a feeling of isolation if they knew that there were other people who would come forward, something which they weren't aware of in your world because the settlements were confidential. We also told you that the existence of public knowledge that a large number of children had been abused, something that only ever happened in our world, forced the church and forced the state to respond to that in a way that made the culture of secrecy that caused so many children to be damaged in this way to be something that was combated. We thought that was true even if we couldn't necessarily prove every single one of these cases in court, because the public still knew that this was something that existed. They still knew that this was a problem, and children still knew that there were other people who had gone through the same experiences that they had gone through. What Melbourne tried to tell us was that people were more likely to report in cases where there was a greater assurance of justice and where there were quicker court proceedings. We have two responses to this. Firstly, we didn't agree that the incentive calculus actually existed. We thought that the only thing that parents actually cared about was a sense of justice. We thought that the church gave them a false sense of justice. We gave them an actual sense of justice where the church didn't have that option. We also told you that the court proceedings were specifically designed to reduce the amount of psychological damage that it imposed on those parents in order to encourage them to come forward for that reason. But the second and more important kind of response that we gave was that it didn't matter if you guys incentivized more people to come forward, because you got them to come forward in a way that was worse for every actor in this debate. You got them to come forward in a way that didn't give any kind of meaningful justice to that child, because they probably didn't see a dollar's worth of money, because the priest was probably still in their community, still molesting other children, and because they didn't have any sense that any kind of meaningful justice had actually been brought upon them. Even if less people did report in our world, what we told you was that that mattered way, way more, because it actually created the change to this culture that caused all these children to be harmed in this way in the first place. But secondly, the second question in this debate, why was it always better for children to go through that lengthy court process than have this secret settlement under your model? What Melbourne told you at the start of their case was that it was important that parents and victims had the liberty to choose what kind of settlement they wanted to have. They never responded at any point to the stuff that Richard came out right at the start of our case about exactly why parents are going to make this decision badly and in a way that doesn't respect the interests of their children. We told you about the kind of financial pressure, the kind of cultural pressure, the kind of community pressure, and the kind of religious pressure that the Catholic Church has the ability to put on those parents, concerns that only affect the parents and don't affect the child. We also told you why those concerns were likely to be overbearing in the context of a historical situation when the full awareness of what the implications of child abuse weren't fully realized, and therefore when parents couldn't make a legitimate calculation about whether or not to report this case. We also told you that victims had more liberty under our case, because in our world, what happened was they had the knowledge that there was other people who shared their experiences, that a world where the Catholic Church and the state was actually sensitive to their needs, because people were willing to speak up and were willing to combat the existence of this culture. Ours was the side where victims felt like they had more liberty to come up and report what had happened to them. But we also told you that it was always better to have a full trial. We told you that the court proceedings were sensitive, that the legal system could offer these victims anonymity. Tyrone told us that there was an adversarial context in which this would occur. He never explained to us how that affected the child in any meaningful way, when it was their lawyers and their parents who were actually engaging practically in the court proceedings. We also thought it was bizarre for Tyrone to defend the idea that the church, the very organisation that molested these children, was the best placed organisation to then provide them with psychological services, rather than the state, which is obviously much better placed to do that. We told you that the only way that a healing process could occur was both if the child knew that the perpetrator of their victims was behind bars, and if the fact that a wrongdoing had been committed upon them was something that was acknowledged by the state. Something that never happened when you got a morally neutral settlement under your model. That was why reconciliation wasn't good enough, because that didn't actually imply any perception of wrongdoing on your side of the house. We also told you that children's safety was still compromised when the people who had perpetrated those crimes against them were still in those communities. Even if it wasn't that individual child, it was some other child who was then the victim of the fact that person was never brought to justice. Melbourne told you that there was some sense in which a neutral settlement was better justice, except they never got any discussion about reform that they wanted to say at that. It was obvious that in the real world in which this debate was occurring, the church didn't reform like Beck tried to tell you. We also just didn't agree that the church accepted any meaningful liability What actually happened was they secretly decided that a financial settlement was good enough and that meant that any kind of liability was removed. Tyrone told you that it was bad because these people were socially excluded. We thought that happened under either case because the child's social exclusion came about by the sense of abuse. We also thought people liked to respond sympathetically to the idea that a child was being sexually abused. We don't think Tyrone proved otherwise. We also told you that there's massive flow-on benefits to other members of the community because even if we can't actually prove every single one of these cases, we still change the culture. We didn't think that the deterrent effect of losing cases was good enough because we thought the mere fact that people were aware that the cases were occurring was what was going to create the cultural change. Mr. Speaker, the only way that any change happened in either world was if people were willing to speak up and put these awful people behind bars. We were the only team that delivered that, and we were very proud to propose.
Third speaker affirmative. I'd like to welcome the third speaker of opposition.
The opposition in this case were only ever willing to engage with a fantasy of the outcomes which were going to happen here. All of their points were implicitly premised on almost 100% of these cases resulting in convictions, not the cases where these things wouldn't result in convictions. And in that case, you replace the message of implicit condoning with a court actively telling the child that they lied, that their case is illegitimate, that they were not abused by that priest. And when that happens, that harm is so much incredibly worse, and they were never willing to engage with that harm. So, two main things in rebuttal. Which case will get more reporting and more convictions, and what is the implicit, preference for a settlement over trial, and which is better for children. So, which delivers more reporting and more conviction? But before I get into the substantive parts of this point, I would like to point out the curious case shift that occurred at the third speaker there. Because at first speaker, all of their points were premised on reaching a greater critical mass of these cases. That there would be more and more of them, and that would be the thing that would create change. But by Goldie, we heard that it doesn't matter if we actually get less cases, but the fact that those cases are high profile means that you get those better outcomes. We think we've effectively shown that we will get more cases under our model. But even if this occurs, like there are still some court cases when you can have confidential settlements. Not everyone takes the confidential settlement. So if you only took a handful of cases to get the outcomes they achieved, then you still got those outcomes under our model, but without forcing hundreds and thousands of children to go through this horribly damaging process. So we think that is a much better outcome. So why do we get more reporting and more convictions? Because they wanted to talk about the power imbalance that exists between the church and these families from first speaker onwards. They were never willing to concede that that power balance might still exist when you don't have confidential settlements. That power imbalance still exists in terms of the financial power of the church versus these individuals, in terms of the moral authority of the church versus these individuals, and in terms of the trauma that these individuals have undergone. Now, if parents were biased under either side, that they can't make this decision correctly, then they're going to be just as biased and just as unable to make the correct decisions under that side as well, because you still have all those pressures that are just compounded by the adversarial process that these people are going to do. And moreover, these things occur to the most vulnerable actors in the debate, the ones that have already been traumatized and already been shocked. Now they said that changing these sorts of things and giving people the option of going through a court settlement is likely to make sure that less people come forward. Because there isn't that same perception of justice, there isn't that same expectation that they will go to trial. For the stakeholders in this debate who care about going through a trial so much that making sure that you have the option of a confidential settlement is likely to discourage them. They were probably already going to choose the trial under either model if they called the prospect of that trial to be that important that they would discard it like that. So we don't think that our model is going to fail. Although, as we said, we think that these sort of private settlements are more beneficial, are better. The ones who are going to be discouraged are the ones who aren't that invested in a trial, who might be willing to be dissuaded by the court's power, who might be willing to, who might be that much more pressured by the financial and moral power of that church. And those are the massive marginal cases which you are going to discourage from ever coming forward under this sort of a model. In terms of kids coming forward, they said that when you create the perception that these things can just be dealt with and just be dealt with like that, that means that kids don't come forward. We think that they replace that message with an even more powerful one of if you come forward, you may be subject to a horrible and traumatic court case. We think that's much more likely to serve as a disincentive to those kids coming forward. So, in terms of this effect on the church, now we think that the impetus, they said that there was no impetus for moving priests under our model because you don't get that same, secrecy, you don't get that same exposure. We think the weight of the settlements, the weight of the increased settlements that we get under our model force that institutional change because, as Beck said, they serve as an existential threat to the church. It means that they need to change their sort of behaviour if they want to get these things. But they were never willing to deal with what would happen to these parish priests if they were exonerated in a court of law. If, instead of the outcomes that they want to happen, these priests were proved innocent. In that case, these parish priests won't only not be moved around, they'll probably be able to stay in the parish that they're in, which is probably a much more bad scenario for these sorts of people. So, which is better, especially for children, a settlement or a trial? They said that a trial challenges that culture of secrecy, regardless of the outcome. We think that it challenges it only to replace it with a different culture, a worse culture. A culture where the church actively fights and denies these sorts of claims instead of accepting some sort of complicit liability. We also think the effect on the media means that you're less likely to be paying attention to the core issues and more likely to be distracted by trivialities about the amount of money and things like that. But which is better for children? Now they said that all throughout the court process, the fact that a settlement would always be worse because it didn't contain that active condemnation of the priest. It didn't assign blame in the same way. Now we think that a settlement does do those things. It's an acceptance of liability. It means that one party is giving money to the other party, which implies that there is some sort of guilt relationship in that sort of scenario. It does imply that one side is wrong and one side is right. We think that exists under their model. In terms of reconciliation, they said that this was worse because it didn't mean that it was explicitly bad, that the church wasn't being explicitly condemned. Now we think that if reconciliation helps people move past and get over the horrible dissonance they have in their heads between fighting for individual justice and fighting against their church, which they view as the spiritual authority on earth, if reconciliation can provide a way out for those individuals, a way out of that horrible mental torture, we are all too happy to stand by it. We think that's a good thing for those individuals. But in terms of what will happen if these people are wrong, if the court case doesn't go their way, if the court instead decides that the priest was innocent, or if there isn't enough evidence to secure a trial. In that case, justice won't heal these children. They won't get that massive message that they were right. They won't get that confirming message that society is on their side and that priest did something terribly wrong. They'll get the exact opposite message. They will get the message that they were wrong. They'll get the message that they lied. And it won't just be an implicit societal message of, sort of ambiguity and doubt. It'll be an all too explicit message to that child that their claims are worthless. Now, if a child got psychologically damaged from having that ambiguity surrounding the identity and guilt of their perpetrator, from ambiguity that resulted in some form of settlement, they're going to be much more affected by being told that they were wrong, being told that they lied. And because the opposition were never able to prove that a significant sort of majority of these cases would result in those convictions, they weren't able to prove that these cases would be better for children. In fact, they're probably going to be a lot worse. And they're going to be a lot worse even if they don't result in convictions. Even if they do result in convictions. Because of the massive trials and massive pressure on that child. They said that, well, children get protection. They get anonymity. They get less pressure put on them in court. They failed to recognize that they only have those protections on them because they are already much more inherently vulnerable by virtue of their position as a child, by virtue of their position as someone who can't deal with pressure in the same way. Our response to that was to give them a way out of that pressure. The opposition's response to that was to force them into that pressure and force them between a horrible choice, between either going through that process or by not going through that process at all. By forcing them to choose between two terrible outcomes, the opposition's model is flawed. Thank you.
Thank you, third speaker of opposition. I'd like to welcome the reply speaker for the opposition, Becky.
Speaker, two questions at the end of today's debate. First of all, had acceptance of these settlements, would it have led to better justice if parents had simply gone through a court case? And second of all, would parents going through court cases for their children led to better social change? First of all, what led to better justice? We told you that for victims, there was always going to be a comparative case between whether it was a court case or a settlement. We told you there were several things that confidential settlements offered that couldn't be provided in court cases. First of all, we told you they allowed victims to determine their own justice, to decide the point at which they wanted to opt out of a court case, and there was an important sense of agency for them. Second of all, we told you that it held the entire church accountable, and that was a really important societal message, to actually have the entire church accept liability rather than individual, and that led to better social outcomes. But thirdly, and most importantly, we told you this actually removed the adversarial element of the court case. And what this actually did was it eliminated the most harmful elements of court case, which particularly pernicious for victims in these cases. We told you victims would no longer be undermined by questions about what actually happened to them, and have questions that were aggressively telling them that they were lying. And moreover, that you weren't going to get lost, which is a possibility that always existed, and their case wanted to play down. It was always something that was going to have a huge net harm, and that's something they never wanted to accept. They asserted that justice only occurred when you either had someone behind bars, and meaningful change occurred. They never explained why those two things would necessarily be linked, or why change would necessarily occur when you actually had court cases not winning, or why court cases simply being in the public eye would necessarily lead to any kind of better change. We told you why confidential settlements led to, and that acceptance of liability was important. That showed what actually was the outcome. But moreover, we told you the end result was that people were actually more likely to come forward in this case, because their vulnerability and often things like financial pressures meant that the option of a settlement was a really important thing. Because social pressures and financial pressures meant that parents were told they had to opt out of that court case and go into a settlement. We told you those social pressures and financial pressures existed equally, except when the option of settlement was no longer there, parents were less likely to engage in a court case at all, and you never got any kind of justice because people had no incentive to come forward. They told us you got more public reporting, which is exactly what we needed, and that was what they told us was the entire point of this. Number one, we had three responses to this. We rejected that only public reporting helped. We told you that it was important not to ignore the significant reconciliation that victims got out of actually having confidential settlement and of having their confidentiality protected. But secondly, we told you that for those who did report and went through the court proceeding, they would actually perhaps go through the court proceeding. But the most important stakeholder in this debate were the parents who had accepted court settlement and what they would do if they hadn't had the option of actually going through with that. We told you they were less likely to come forward in any way at all. But more likely, we told you there was a significant harm that occurred from having that court case. They always relied on the ideal outcome of a perfect court case where it was going to be minimal harm to the child and you were likely to have a successful outcome. That simply wasn't the reality in this debate. It simply isn't the reality that this context has provided. And it ignored all the harms that we showed you. We showed you that better justice is more likely to occur when you allow confidential settlements. This is the second question, and what would have led to better social outcomes? They told us two things that led to social outcomes. Firstly, the sheer critical mass of cases, and secondly, having a public view. We told you already why the critical mass is less likely to occur in the previous point. But on having things having to be in the public. Number one, we think it is more important to hold the entire church accountable than individual priests. The point about having to hold individuals accountable never actually meant you actually got any better change. Moreover, we told you there were two things why the whole church is important to hold accountable. Firstly, where priests and individuals who had perpetrated crimes were dead. They told us that was a minority group. That didn't mean that they didn't exist in this debate, and they never actually gave any response as to what would happen in these cases or what kind of justice would exist for these individuals. But secondly, it sent a social message that the church was accountable. We told you that you were more likely to get an acceptance of liability, and that was the important and the key thing in this debate that occurred with confidential settlements, that you were less likely to get when those didn't exist. That acceptance of liability meant the church was accepting that it had committed something wrong, accepted that it needed reform, and that was the outcome that was less likely. So we showed you that social change was more likely to occur for those reasons we won this debate.
Thank you, opposition reply. To close the case and the debate of affirmative, I'd like to welcome the affirmative reply, Richard.
Mr. Speaker, we recognise that parents made a moral call that denied justice to their children because they were being counselled to do so by their children's attacker. We thought that was reprehensible and not within the moral authority of those parents. I've got two issues in reply. Firstly, are parents well placed to make this decision? And secondly, did settlements suppress better outcomes? So firstly, are parents well placed to make this decision? And on the app, we thought that when the church colluded with parents to suppress such cases, that was an instance of parents damaging their children's basic right to seek the right to right, one of history's greatest wrongs. Parents prioritised the wrong things in thinking about the healing of their children. So they thought that money could be a good way to deal with that harm. We didn't think that was good enough. That told us, however, that parents were also a victim because they shared in their children's pain, and that was really important that they could seek justice. On a prioritisation of victims' rights, we were willing to prioritise getting outcomes for children over what parents might think, Mr. Speaker. We didn't think parents' suffering came even close. They then said that we never dealt with the power imbalance between the church and parents and how that would lead to bad outcomes. But we did, Mr. Speaker. That was my entire analysis on why parents got bad results for their children, because they had those social pressures and those religious pressures. They fell victim to the financial pressure, particularly those poorer Catholic families that I wanted to talk about. What they said, though, was money helped those children to heal, so that financial pressure was fine. We never understood how money helped children to get over such psychological and physical abuse. But if so, we thought it was much less than the justice of getting your perpetrator behind bars or appearing in the court. Then we said that we didn't, parents were made bad moral choices because they didn't understand the level of psychological harm that would come to their children as a result of this crime. We thought that that led to those choices being ineffective. Then they said that parents were just choosing another type of acceptance of liability and healing. We didn't think that was so at all. We thought that a signing of agreement outside of court was not an acceptance of guilt by the church, but the church saying that we will pay you to not drag this through the courts. That's what we see in all sorts of extra court settlements, and we don't think that is an acceptance of guilt. Secondly, did settlements suppress better outcomes? And what they told us was that signing these agreements meant the church was publicly accepting guilt. We thought that showed that they didn't understand what they were meant to be defending on their side of the house, because what they were defending was confidential agreements between parties. That meant that there was no public accountability for those actions. But they kept asserting that under their world, more people went to trial. Fortunately for us, their world and the counterfactual that they were defending was the status quo. What we saw was that victims' rights were suppressed and people didn't go to court because they thought that they would lose those battles and they thought that the healing was done to their children. What we told you was that had these agreements not been signed, more people would be likely to come and seek justice because those parents had wanted justice in the first place before the church counselled them out of that. They said that children would be harmed by going through prolonged cases. We thought that there were protections that existed for those children. But what hurt children more was when they were told by their parents that that was done, that healing process was done, and that they should move on from that harm. We allowed them to seek a verdict of guilt. Then they told us that we never proved that everyone would go, or there would be a deluge. What I actually told you at first was we thought that even if only a few went, we'd get some outcomes. But even if none went, we thought it was principally better that there wasn't this covering up happening. That was something we were perfectly happy to defend. Mr. Speaker, parents did not have the moral authority to stop that pursuit of justice for their children. We're proud to propose.
That's the end of the debate. The leaders please come on the floor and that please go directly down to the